This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. The role of government in regulating food safety came up recently when the FDA and Agriculture Department were shut down. But food expert Robert Paarlberg says the biggest health danger lies in your own kitchen. Historian Richard Moe tells us that FDR never wanted to run for a third term until World War II made him. He also says Obama can take a lesson from FDR by using executive power when Congress won't cooperate. And Bill Press talks about the legacy of JFK with political scientist Larry Sabato. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Professor Robert Paarlberg is an expert on American agriculture and food production. He says there's no evidence of risk from genetically modified organisms. But what's most likely to make you sick is how you prepare food in your own kitchen. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Robert Paarlberg is a political science professor at Wellesley College and adjunct professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. A leading authority on food policy, he has just published the second edition of the book, Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. Robert Paarlberg, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Why has something as simple and universal as food become such a big political issue?
Food isn't simple. It's not just a source of sustenance. Food has always been linked to identity, and there's nothing more complicated than that. Think about it. Religious faiths use rules about food to delineate who is one of us and who isn't. People make decisions about what they eat partly for the purpose of expressing solidarity with others who are making the same decisions. What we eat and the way we eat is often a part of some quest for belonging or for establishing our status. It's a terrain that invites strong political conflict, social, political, and ethical conflict.
What is the definition of organically grown food, and does buying it really help the environment? I mean, it sure doesn't really seem to save money.
Organically grown food is food that's grown without the use of any synthetic or human-produced fertilizers or pesticides. And prior to the development of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer early in the 20th century, in fact, all of the world's food supply was de facto organic. Since the 20th century and the spread of nitrogen fertilizer use, the organic share of total food production in rich countries has become quite small. Currently in the United States, only about 1% of cropland is being farmed organically. As for the environmental impacts, organic farms do use fewer chemicals, but they typically require more land for every bushel of production because yields in organic systems tend to be only about two-thirds as high as yields in conventional systems that use nitrogen fertilizer. So if we were to convert all of our production to organic methods today in the United States, we'd have to plow up much more land to get the same total output, and that wouldn't be good for the environment. So organic systems may help reduce some kinds of chemical runoff, but if you scaled them up, they would make very large demands on land resources.
So is it kind of a
difficult trade-off?
Yeah, is it a pick your poison sort of scenario, almost? Maybe that's not the right way to. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but
well, to some extent. But the conventional non-organic systems are doing a much better job than they used to of controlling chemical use. If you think back to the early 1960s when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which was primarily a treatise against the use of DDT in farming, farms in the United States were wildly excessive in their use of highly toxic pesticides. But things have improved. Pesticide use in U.S. agriculture actually peaked in 1973 and has been down ever since. Fertilizer use in American farming has been peaked in 1981 and has been in decline recently. So conventional farming systems are using new precision application machinery, including GPS systems, to do a much better job of containing the excessive use of chemicals.
Has anything been proven about health hazards of genetically modified organisms? GMOs, as we commonly refer to them?
Yeah, GMO foods have been grown and consumed for nearly 20 years now. And if you ask national science academies in Europe, for example, and my guess is that's a fairly credible place to go for an opinion, those national science academies in Europe will say in writing that they found no evidence of any new risks either to human health or to the environment from any of the GMOs that have been placed on the market so far. And that's even the official view of the research directorate of the European Union Commission. Of course, the critics remain skeptical. They say, well, absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. And so they hold to their position that it's too soon to tell, or we haven't tested for the appropriate hypothetical risk, or the evidence is somehow being suppressed. But national science academies around the world are in agreement that we haven't yet found any new risks, either to human health or to the environment, from the GMOs on the market so far.
We're speaking with Robert Paarlberg, political science professor at Wellesley College, adjunct professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's a leading authority on food policy, and we're discussing the just published second edition of the book, Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. When someone goes to the grocery store to buy produce, either loose vegetables or prepackaged, how sure can they be that it's safe to eat?
The food that's sold in grocery stores is certainly safer than it ever has been before. That isn't to say that food is always safe to eat. We know from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention that roughly 3,000 Americans die every year from foodborne diseases like, for example, salmonella or listeria or toxoplasma. But in most cases, the contamination isn't contained in the packaged or the unpackaged food that you buy in the grocery store. Most of the contamination is introduced after it's purchased. It's usually introduced in the home. Now, contaminated food is occasionally sold in the market, and there are contamination outbreaks that get huge headlines. And yet, if you look at the magnitude, that's not where the problem really lies. Look at the worst such outbreak from grocery store products in the last 30 years. It was in 2011 when listeria was found in cantaloupes. And this outbreak took 33 lives. Well, 33 lives is far too many. But compared to the 3,000 Americans that die every year, mostly from contaminations introduced in the home, those 33 lives from a supermarket-induced outbreak are pretty small.
What health precautions should a consumer take? If you're saying that, all right, so your food is, generally speaking, it's safe when you go and you buy it, but perhaps you're doing things at home that you should or shouldn't be doing that are going to cause you to get sick. So what kind of precautions do they take?
Well, the first thing to do, of course, is to wash your hands. The second thing to do is don't cook for anyone else if you have a cold. Don't sneeze in the kitchen. Wash the cutting board. And don't put the cooked meat back on the platter that held the uncooked meat. And I guess most of all, make sure that the hamburger is thoroughly cooked. Or if you want to be cautious for food safety and also careful about your health, I would cut down on your hamburger consumption considerably, one way or the other.
Fair enough. That's probably another topic for another program for us.
Right.
We talk about that. Now, a lot of activists claim the Food and Drug Administration and the Agriculture Department are in bed with the food industry. How do you assess the job done by these agencies in protecting consumers?
Well, I would draw a distinction between food that is unsafe versus food that is safe but unhealthy. And federal agencies, I think, do a pretty good job of protecting us from food that is unsafe, that is, food that has microbial contamination. And this is because the food industry itself has an incentive to cooperate here in its own self-interest. Food companies know that a single unsafe bad actor can frighten consumers away from products and can hurt everybody's sales. So federal agencies usually find a lot of enthusiastic cooperative assistance when they're pushing for methods to reduce the contamination of food products. But federal agencies do very little to protect us from food that is safe but unhealthy. In America, foods that contain too much salt, too much sugar, too much fat, foods that are sold in portions that are much too large. This is everywhere, and these foods they're found in school cafeterias. They're advertised to children on Saturday morning television shows. The federal government does very little here to protect us. When the federal government fails here to constrain the advertising of unhealthy foods, though, it usually isn't a failure of federal agencies like the Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Trade Commission. It's more often, frankly, a result of food companies enjoying too much protection from their friends in the Congress and even from the federal court system. We have in the United States concluded that advertising should be considered commercial speech protected under the First Amendment. So it's much more difficult in the United States than it is in Europe, for example, to put restrictions on the advertising of unhealthy food to children.
Is obesity now a bigger problem than world hunger, a bigger threat to health than the safety of our food?
Well, globally, the number of obese people does continue to increase. It's soon going to eclipse the total number who are hungry, and the number who are hungry is actually in a fairly steady decline despite continued global population growth. So numerically, the obesity problem is soon going to eclipse the hunger or the undernourishment problem. But I still worry much more about hunger than I do about obesity. Mm-hmm. I think hunger is a much bigger policy problem than obesity for several reasons. First, undernourished people, many of whom are infants and children, usually have fewer options for self-help than do people who are obese. So there's a more obvious and obviously appropriate role for policy interventions for hunger. Second, it's possible to be both obese and healthy. You can be both heavy and healthy, but it's not possible to be undernourished and to be healthy. So if the concern is health, we should focus on health rather than on the shape or the size of the body. Also, we should remember that being heavy is sometimes genetically predetermined. Being undernourished is not genetically predetermined. We should attack the problem that isn't genetically predetermined, and we should not stigmatize those who are heavy because of genetic predetermination. And finally, I would focus on hunger because while we don't yet know how to reverse the increase in obesity prevalence in the United States, we we do know how to end hunger. You do it by lifting people out of poverty or by providing them with safety net assistance. So for all those reasons, I would continue to define hunger as the number one problem.
Okay. Robert Paarlberg, political science professor at Wellesley College, adjunct professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, talking about his just published second edition of the book, Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. Professor, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
You bet. Thank you very much.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Author Richard Moe has studied the 1940 presidential election, and contrary to what most people think, FDR never wanted a third term. We'll hear from him in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
What amazing alchemists Wall Street bankers are. They can turn failure into gold and reform into business as usual. These sorcerers have pulled off both tricks right in front of us since their 2007 collapse. They turned that gross failure into an ongoing multi-trillion-dollar bailout by us taxpayers to restore them to even grosser profit levels. Then, while the public howled for lawmakers to shackle their greed, these bewitching bankers reached into their magic hat and pulled out the massive Dodd-Frank reform law that, hocus pocus, adds up to the status quo. And, as a West Texas farmer once told me, status quo is Latin for the mess we're in. Wall Street's greatest deception is the claim that they're brave risk-takers who put their money into enterprises that create America's economic growth. Bovine excrement. One, as we've seen, they're not investing in enterprises. They're frittering away America's investment funds on ridiculous get-rich-quick gambling schemes. Second, they're not risking their money or that of their shareholders, but ours. When we deposit money with Chase, Bank of America, etc., we make a practically zero-interest loan to them that they take to global gambling tables. Of the $2.4 trillion held by J.P. Morgan Chase, for example, $2.2 trillion is borrowed from us. It's our cash they're risking. And when their convoluted gambles fail, as in 2007, everything collapses, and they'll run to Washington again, demanding a bailout. So the reform that matters is to make them put, say, half of their own money into each roll of the dice, rather than piling 90% of each risk on our backs. But does the Dodd-Frank reform law do that? No, it allows banks to stack 95% of their risk on us. This is Jim Hightower saying that is Wall Street's dirtiest trick yet.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Historian and author Richard Moe says FDR ran for a third term only because he couldn't find another Democrat who would follow his policies and could win the election. He also says President Obama has something to learn from FDR's second-term blues. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Richard Moe served as Chief of Staff to Vice President Walter Mondale and as a senior advisor to President Jimmy Carter. From 1993 to 2010, he was president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. His latest book, Roosevelt's Second Act, which tells the story of how FDR decided to run for an unprecedented third term as war was breaking out in Europe. Richard Moe, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Every school child knows that FDR was the only president to serve more than 2 terms and was elected 4 times. But your new book reveals that he intended to retire after 2 terms. What changed his mind?
Well, that's correct. He had his heart set on retirement, and he was going to go back to his beloved Hyde Park, and he'd made very elaborate plans for that. But war broke out in late 1939, and especially in 1940. And he was trying his hardest to send aid to Britain. And he saw this war eventually coming to the United States. And in the end, after a long, elaborate process, he couldn't find another Democrat who would support his policies and who could be elected. So it was the war, clear and simple, that persuaded him to run again.
Now, FDR wound up running against Wendell Willkie, who was not very well known before then, and not really very well known to history. How did Willkie come from nowhere to win the Republican nomination, and was there anything he could have done to defeat Roosevelt?
Well, Wendell Willkie is one of the most fascinating characters in 20th century American history. He did come from nowhere. He was a utilities executive. He had strong disagreements with Roosevelt on regulatory policy, but he had been a Democrat until a year before he was nominated, and he was an internationalist. So on most policies, they were in sync. But he provided such a contrast with the other Republicans who were running for the nomination that year, who were really the traditional conservative Republicans. And even Republicans knew that war could come to America and that we needed somebody who could see the country through the war. And they liked Willkie. Willkie was very charismatic, a very good campaigner, and he just took that convention by storm.
You know, it's hard to imagine this happening today, but didn't Wendell Willkie, even as FDR was being inaugurated, come to the president's political aid in the fight to win public support for the Lend-Lease program?
He did. After the election, they had dinner together, just the two of them, in the White House, in the president's upstairs study, the night before FDR was inaugurated for a 3rd time. And FDR asked him to go to London as his emissary to talk to Churchill and to report back to him on what he saw. And he came back. He was so moved by the experience. He came back and testified for Lend-Lease. And he made the difference, in Roosevelt's view, in enacting Lend-Lease. And Roosevelt never forgot it.
We're speaking with Richard Moe, former Chief of Staff to Vice President Walter Mondale, as well as Senior Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, and also former President of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and currently the author of Roosevelt's Second Act. Roosevelt expanded the war powers of the presidency when he aided Great Britain without congressional approval. How does that history relate to President Obama's recent move to redefine the president's war powers?
Well, President Roosevelt did find a way to send destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for the use of British bases in the Western Hemisphere, and doing that without going to Congress. And that really expanded the president's war powers in a way that has profoundly affected the presidency, profoundly affected our ability to conduct foreign policy, and contributed to the national security state that we are in today. As I understand President Obama's advocacy of redefining the war powers, I think it's his intention to more accurately define those powers and perhaps constrain them to some extent for future presidents. But all of what's happened since Roosevelt expanded the powers of the presidency has led to presidents doing a lot of different things.
Is that a negative or a positive?
It has been negative and positive, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
I think President Bush's decision to go into Iraq was clearly a negative. You can argue the same thing about Vietnam. But in some cases, I think the president's limited involvement in Libya, I think that could be justified. But you have to take each of these on its own merits.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the run-up to World War II in Europe, FDR faced and overcame nearly universal opposition to American involvement. Was he actually leading from behind, if you will, manipulating public opinion and allowing it to get ahead of him?
FDR was convinced that you had to have public opinion behind you before you could take bold actions, and he didn't think that his words alone would move public opinion to such an extent, particularly when he was facing such an isolationist country as he was in 1940. So he relied on events to change public opinion, and that's what happened in September of 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, and it happened again in May of 1940 when Hitler invaded the Low Countries in France. Those events really changed public opinion, and Roosevelt took advantage of that to move the country forward towards giving more aid to the Allies.
If you look at it in today's times, have we not had anything as devastating as those moves by Hitler to perhaps sway public opinion enough? Or, I mean, it doesn't seem like public opinion, we seem very divided on this, as opposed to everybody coming together and standing behind the president on a particular move.
Well, I don't think there's been anything quite comparable to what Hitler was doing. I mean, he was the personification of evil, and he was trying to conquer all of Europe, and in FDR's view, all of the world. He had no doubt that once Hitler conquered all of Europe, and he was on the verge of doing so, he would turn his attention to the Western Hemisphere and the United States. That was his belief, and that was his great fear, and it predicated everything he did.
Both FDR and Obama have suffered from the curse of the second term. What are the similarities, and what lessons can President Obama learn from President Roosevelt's experience?
President Roosevelt won a huge re-election in 1936. It was a landslide election, but he immediately ran afoul of the Congress when he sent up an ill-considered court-packing plan. It was called that. He cut back on federal spending and caused what was called the Roosevelt recession, 2 million more people unemployed. And then he tried to purge recalcitrant conservative Democrats who didn't support his New Deal programs. So all of these things really led him to a very low ebb during his second term, and that's where he was when this started. President Obama has had a different set of circumstances but they've also contributed to this second-term curse. The primary one was having an ideologically rigid and uncooperative House of Representatives, and we can still see the results of that now with the government shutdown. So it's very different. But what presidents tend to do in their second term is to, because they don't have the sway with the Congress that they did in their first term, is to do things that don't require congressional action. And President Obama has, I think, taken a lesson from FDR in that he is trying to do everything he can to make climate control an issue and to do what he can to bring climate control under control through administrative actions. There are limits to that, of course, but he seems to be doing an excellent job of that.
Okay. Richard Moe, his latest book, Roosevelt's Second Act, which tells the story of how FDR decided to run for an unprecedented third term as war was breaking out in Europe. Richard, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back and talking with you again soon.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand-Up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, political scientist Larry Sabato, about the legacy of JFK.
Regulars here on the program know that, at least once a month, maybe a little more often, we check in with one of the brightest minds in the political world of this country, knows the system better than anybody I know, Dr. Larry Sabato, director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. And we always said that someday we'll get him in the studio. Someday. Well, we've been trying hard, and we finally succeeded. Here he is, Larry Sabato. Nice to see you.
Now you're disappointed. Say.
That's
the problem.
And the occasion for coming in studio is publication of a very, very important book, The Kennedy Half Century, just out, The Presidency, Assassination, and Lasting Legacy of John F. Kennedy. We want to talk about this, Larry, but it's hard to believe 50 years next month, the
Seems like
anniversary of
yesterday.
the assassination. For
Seems
those of
like
us who were
yesterday.
alive then,
Absolutely.
right?
It's one of those flashbulb moments. Everybody remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing and who they talked to, and you just never forget.
But you have some very important new details about the assassination. But what I find equally, maybe more fascinating, is how the Kennedy, and I want you to tell us about this, how the Kennedy legacy has persevered, has continued through these last 50 years, even though he wasn't president that long and didn't accomplish that much as a president. So.
Exactly. No, and I'm glad you focused on that, Bill, because we do have news about the assassination. Naturally, people tend to focus in on that because they're so fascinated in the murder of the century. But to me, the real contribution of the book and the original creative part of it was tracing John F. Kennedy's life after death, which is really what legacy is, through all 9 of his successors. We spent 5 years on this, and I'll tell you, I was really amazed at how much his successor presidents used him, Democrat and Republican alike. Mm-hmm. They quoted his words, they cited his deeds in order to reinforce parts of their own agenda. Right. And that's really a hidden tool in the toolbox of the American presidency, is what the predecessors have done or didn't do, and the new president tries to use those to leverage his own agenda.
Where do we start? How long did it take you on this book?
5 years, and with a great team working with me. We also have, by the way, the largest public opinion study ever of a long-ago presidency done by, we hired Peter Hart and Jeff Guerin to do it. Did a wonderful job comparing Kennedy to his predecessors and successors, 2,000 samples so that we could break it into all kinds of small demographics. It was an online poll so we could use video segments of Kennedy's speeches and so on. So it's kind of a precedent-setting study. That's part of it. We hired a sound firm, one of the best in the world, to help us analyze these audio tapes from November 22nd. So we had a big team working on this book, and I'm very proud of them.
Well, let's start with the assassination, just kind of get that out of the way. There are still people who believe in the grassy knoll theory. I meet them all the time. And there's still people who say other shots were heard. Oswald could not have acted alone. What's the truth?
Here's the truth as best I can determine it. We have had 2 terribly flawed investigations of the Kennedy assassination. The Warren Commission did an awful job. Part of it was their own process, which was political, which was set by the White House. It was on a political schedule to get it done before the 64 campaign. But part of it was that the Warren Commission was simply lied to by the FBI and the CIA, and we detail that. So, and there were members of the Warren Commission who were leaking to certain government agencies behind the scenes. It really was a terrible operation. Bill, I interviewed key witnesses from Dealey Plaza, really important people who had things to say, who were never interviewed by the Warren Commission. How can this be? And the answer is because they were in a rush. It was a rush job.
Wow.
But I was even more critical, as it turned out, of the second investigation, which was done in the 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Now, they have a good excuse. Sound technology in the 70s was not nearly what it is today. So we have tools available they didn't have. Mm-hmm. But they based their conclusion that the assassination was the result of a conspiracy on a recording made at the police department, Dallas Police Department, at the time of the shooting, on an old device called a dictabelt, which we remember, and most people have no idea what it is, but that was the old recording device. The problem is we have now determined where that came from, how it was recorded. There was a policeman with a stuck microphone that allowed the sound to come through, but unfortunately, that policeman was not in Dealey Plaza. He was at the Trade Mart where President Kennedy was going to give his speech that tragically he never delivered.
Wow.
He recorded no gunfire at all. They misinterpreted certain impulses on the dictabelt as being gunshots. You know what it was? It was the rattling of the microphone on the motorcycle.
Good Lord.
So we've got it all in enormous detail.
Yeah.
We've got a chapter in the book on it, but I put the entire massive, detailed, mind-numbing report on our website, thekennedyhalfcentury.com.
So this leads you to believe that there was only one
Well, I think it
gunman?
certainly removes one of the big pillars of support for the theory of a second gunman. But I will also say this, Bill. Having studied Oswald's career thoroughly, there are so many questions in my mind, not only about him, but about some of the things that happened on November 22nd right there in Dealey Plaza. I don't rule out the possibility that someone encouraged Oswald. It's even possible that someone was there to supervise. It's possible someone was there with a second gun that either didn't fire or missed. Mm-hmm. The bullet trajectories clearly came from Oswald in the sixth floor. I don't think there's any question.
Now, on Kennedy's legacy, I'm a great admirer of JFK, and I shook his hand when I was a high school student, right? And he certainly inspired me, as millions of Americans, to get involved in politics, to believe in their government and all of that. But it is kind of strange in the fact when you look at how long he was president and what little he accomplished, his impact is so much bigger and larger than that. How do you explain it?
Let me give you an anecdote that will explain it. When President Kennedy was in the White House, he one evening invited a historian over to give a lecture on Lincoln. And Kennedy asked the first question after the lecture, and he said, if Lincoln had not been assassinated, would he be as well remembered today? The historian said, of course not, because he would have had to face the terrible problems of Reconstruction. He would have suffered from the same things most presidents do in their second terms, and on. And Kennedy said, I thought so. Later, apparently, he commented to Jackie, this was shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, if they're going to get me, this would be a good time to do it, meaning he left it in triumph. Well, a year later, of course, that's what happened. And the truth is, had he served 2 full terms, given what was coming in the 60s, even if he didn't do what Johnson did in Vietnam, and I happen to think he would not have. I don't believe there's any chance he would have put 535,000 troops in Vietnam, but lots of other things were happening in the 60s. I think Kennedy's reputation would be considerably less than it is now. So I'm not saying that's a good trade-off for an assassination. Of course it isn't. But the assassination had a dramatic effect on Kennedy. Our survey shows that he is still the most popular modern president. And he's the only one who's a bipartisan president. Believe it or not, while Democrats are overwhelmingly for him, a majority of Republicans support him too.
I was fascinated by the poll that you ask Americans to rate all their presidents from 1950 to 2000 on a scale of 0 to 10. Kennedy, the highest.
Exactly.
At 7.6%.
And he's the only short-term president in American history who has that kind of rating in the entire history of the country, because it takes a while to make an impact on the public. You need at least 2 full terms. Roosevelt had 3 and a piece.
And I also found it strange that if any former leader, alive or dead, could serve again, who would you want to bring back? Abraham Lincoln got 9%. Lincoln only 9%. Reagan was first with 24%.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a partisan response, obviously, and 24% is hardcore Republicans.
Yeah,
but
right.
I have to say, I clearly learned anew how little Americans know about their own history, and it's especially true with the young. My Center for Politics is totally dedicated to civic education and civic participation, mainly among the young, and boy, do we need it. Oh, my God, the signals from this survey, I was disturbed.
And you were saying just, again, at the very top of the show, I think is an important point, that you have found, looking at the 9 presidents, every one of the 9 presidents since, Republican and Democrat, have tried somehow to wear the mantle of John F. Kennedy, right?
Yes, they've either tried to do it with his rhetoric, because let's face it, you said it yourself, you were inspired. I first got involved in politics as a 7-year-old passing out literature in my neighborhood for John F. Kennedy. I caught a glimpse of him 4 days before the election. Most exciting thing that had ever happened to me. Probably still to this day, Bill, except for your show.
Thank you.
I just wanted to throw that in. But really, he did this for millions, and we just kept coming across people in the survey, and we had focus groups in a lot of major cities about Kennedy, and they would still talk about him as though he were in the room. They felt they knew him, even though clearly his abilities, they put him on a pedestal, but they felt they knew him in some way and they related to him. Maybe it was the self-deprecating humor. Maybe it was the enveloping rhetoric. Presidents have been able to use this, as they should. They should use all the tools at their disposal.
A book, not only to read, a book to buy, The Kennedy Half Century. We have a link up on our website, and of course you can get it at Amazon or your local bookstore, by Dr. Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia. Your questions, your comments, how Kennedy might have impacted you, or questions about his presidency or the assassination, 866-55-PRESS. We'll be right back with Larry Sabato here on the Bill Press Show. Here we go again at 26 minutes now after the hour. Dr. Larry Sabato is the author of the monumental new volume, The Kennedy Half Century. Hard to believe, The Kennedy Half Century, but well named. The Presidency, Assassination, and Lasting Legacy of John F. Kennedy. Great to see you, Larry. Honor to have you in studio.
Thank you so much, Bill. Great
Peter?
to be with you.
It is a great honor to have him in studio. We always talk to him on the phone as often as we can. But now that we're here, people are paying attention. We're on Twitter at BP Show, where Astasia says Larry Sabato is more handsome in person.
Oh.
All of that smart, and he's funny. Watching him on the Full Court Press this morning. So there you go.
Thank you very much. You clearly don't know me.
This is from a female listener.
I appreciate that very, very much. If you were here, you'd feel differently, and probably once you fully wake up, you will.
You don't understand. It always pisses me off when our guests get all these gushing comments about how handsome they are. All right.
It happens.
Hello.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Larry, I can't let you come in the studio without asking you a couple of quick things. Okay, we're focused on the Kennedy book, but nobody knows politics better than you. You're in Virginia. What's going to happen with the governor's race?
You know our crystal ball operations, the UVA Center for Politics. We were the very first in the country to lean this race to Terry McAuliffe and the Democrats in August. We've never changed a thing. No reason to. It's over. It's been over. The structure of the race favors McAuliffe. I think he would win in a two-way race, but he's certainly being helped by the presence of a libertarian candidate who's collecting around 10%. It goes from 8 to 12, somewhere in that vicinity. Yeah. And disproportionately, those are Republican votes. But why are they voting libertarian? Because they see Ken Cuccinelli as being too right-wing on social issues. And those are the old fiscal conservative Republicans who are voting libertarian to send a message to their party.
And from your perspective there at the Center for Politics, what do you think about this mess in Washington? We just have about 30 seconds here.
Bill, we teach at UVA that politics is a good thing. I'm reconsidering the slogan. That's what I think about it.
Yeah, it is that bad.
No, it's awful. I can't even stand to watch it anymore, and I think a lot of people agree with me.
This is such an important contribution for so many reasons. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for coming in. Again, the Kennedy Half Century, an amazing, amazing presence in American politics still today of John F. Kennedy. Thanks, Larry Sabato.
This was a lot of fun, Bill.
Great
Thank
to see
you so
friend.
much.
All right. Dennis Van Rokel from the National Education Association, president, here next on The Bill Press Show.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Robert Paarlberg, Richard Moe, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to